In order to start dominating your ranked matches, you need to start incorporating pro tactics into your gameplay so that you give yourself the best shot at victory each and every time. In this video, we're going to be breaking down 6 advanced tactics that pros and high-level players use alike. But before we get started, smash that sub button so you don't miss out on any in-depth videos or news that we have to cover. But enough talking, let's just jump right into it, shall we? So we've already got to the point that the general player will often play default, baiting out utility for a certain amount of time. They will play default, put impression to the enemy, and force them to use utility, so enemies don't have that much utility when pushing onto point, so it's a lot easier to secure a site. Now, another mix-up to this is actually rotating off the site, and most likely, you're doing it incorrectly. What pros will often do, instead of rotating every single person off the site, is they'll leave one person behind to put in constant fire and pressure into the enemy. They constantly create this pressure to not only bait more utility, but to force a certain amount of enemies to not rotate. Because if you simply stop firing and everyone rotates, then the enemy is going to rotate at the same time and catch you off guard. Now, this is even better if the person that is remaining actually breaks things like a sage wall. If someone raises up a sage wall, you can allow your team to start rotating, but at the same time, the person behind starts to break down that sage wall, which gives the perception that enemies are going to push onto point without the information, which is extremely important, and it often will prevent enemies from rotating or will make them even use more utility. This forces the team to respect the site that you're currently on and not leave it, so they give up site control to your team who have rotated and planted, or at the very least, they can't send everyone to rotate and plant, making it a lot easier on your team that is actually pushing the other point. Now, the next big question you might have is what happens to the lone person? Well, afterwards, you assume the role of lurker. You either want to block off angles for enemies to push on one side of the map or flank their potential retake onto a point. This is a very powerful and impactful role because not only can you gather information, but if the opportunity presents itself, you can even make a play on the enemy as well. Now, the next big tactic that we have for you is controlling powerful angles. Let me ask you this question. What would happen if you tried to push on a site and you didn't use a single smoke? You would most likely just all die, right? You're gonna get killed from heaven, you're gonna get swung from the angles. There's no way that you're gonna just make it onto point without taking any fire or losing anybody. So usually, in order to take these angles from the enemy temporarily, you smoke them off and block that LOS. Now, a lot of these angles will be like the choke points, something like stairwell, something like heaven. Those are the common places that you're smoking off. Now, after you plant out in the open, you as a team need to go out and control the same positions that you smoked off. Those are called the power angles, and you need to effectively control these angles. You want to send people to these angles so that you control it, because guess what? If the enemy tries to push onto point to defuse and they don't have smokes to control those same power angles, it's going to be exactly like if you pushed onto point and didn't smoke off all these angles. Guess what? They're going to die in the same way that you're going to die, and most of the time, they're not going to have smokes in order to retake a site. On top of this, even if they manage to kill people in the power angles, you get information about where the enemies are, which is incredibly important, and the fact that you get spiked down in the open means that they can get peeked from any of the angles, and if they kill anyone in any of the angles, you will get perfect information about where they're coming from. This sets the enemy up in a giant disadvantage, and on top of that, there's a huge time crunch working against them, which means that controlling these powerful angles is one of the most important things that you can do after you plant a spike. Now, moving on to the third thing that we have to talk about, the third pro tactic is rushing. And honestly, in the lower ranks or just in general, people are rushing way too much. You need to stop rushing nonstop. We talked about this before, but this is pretty obvious, and this is not an advanced concept or anything. But first off, you need to stop rushing. You need to bait out utility first and gain information. However, rushing can be used under these circumstances. One, you're using it as a mix-up and not a normal strat, and you're on an eco round where it's very unlikely for you to win with traditional methods. You see, a successful rush can force out trades, allowing you to upgrade your guns to the enemy's guns and take point control, which puts the ball in your court. Especially when the enemy has much better economy than you, a rush push can be difficult, but it can be one of the few ways that you can actually leverage your numbers advantage in order to win the round at such a disadvantage. Now, the most important thing if you're planning on rushing is to take note of the enemy's team composition and try to rush a side that does not have AoE abilities or other area denial. Sage and Cypher being the worst two that can shut down a rush push instantly, so you do not want to push into these characters if you can at all help it. Now, pop flashers are actually the easiest to rush because they usually want to take engagements and not be engaged on. They like to control the range. I mean, think about a Phoenix and a Reyna. They want to be able to control the range that you're in when they start their engagement. They don't want you to be already on top of them before they get a chance to set up these flashes. Now, lastly, the element of surprise is extremely important when you're rushing. When you are going to the choke as a team, slow walk until you get to the choke. Don't let any person know that you're there. Once the rush starts, it will either be successful and the team fight will start and it will be extremely scrappy, or it will fail right off the bat. Don't be afraid to slow walk as a team to a choke point and make the enemy sweat a little bit. Wait out by a choke point, not peeking out, but waiting there for a certain amount of time. You could even wait 30 or 40 seconds. Then out of nowhere, you get the go ahead and then you rush on the point. This can be a really powerful mix-up strategy on eco attack rounds. Now, for the fourth advanced strat that we have for you is second round hard stacking. This is another tip in order to win a round that you have a huge disadvantage in. Everyone knows how big of a disadvantage it is if on second round defense, you lost the first round. The disadvantage is gigantic because most of the time you're going to be saving, you're only going to have pistols, and the enemies are going to have much better guns. This is why an all or nothing gamble can actually be viable. If you give up sight control versus players with better guns and ammo, it is almost a sure loss. And honestly, if enemies push onto one of the sites you're holding and you only have 2 people there and they push with 4 or 5 members, they're going to have better guns than you, which means you're going to either just get killed without being able to trade out, or you have to rotate off the point, which means that you're going to have to retake when they have that advantage. So sometimes pro players have actually been incorporating multi-stacks onto one site. They will stack usually 4 people on one site while one person lurks for info. What this does is it allows them to hold an angle and punish an enemy that jiggle peeks it because they're going to aim punch him into the floor, and it gives you a chance to actually get some kills and be ready for where the enemy pushes. Now, when you incorporate this strategy, if the enemy pushes the other point that you're not waiting on, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. But the thing is, if they push the point that you were actually stacking on, you have the chance to actually turn this hugely disadvantaged round. So essentially, you're gambling on that chance because otherwise your odds are already so slim in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that this is a strategy you should use each and every time, but it's something that you should think about. Enemies could be using it against you, or you can use it against enemies in a pinch, and if they're not expecting it, you can completely shut down and win a round that you had no business winning. Now, before we move on to step 5, the big takeaway about this and pro play in general on second round when you lost the first round is that risky strats are almost always necessary to win that pistol second round if you lost the first round. It is incredibly difficult to win that second round, and across the board, it is almost like you win that first round, you're almost guaranteed to win that second round. That's why high risk, high reward strats are even better on the second round than any other round in the entire game. Now, moving on to the 5th big strategy that we have for you. This is juicing up an entry fragger on the first round. Now, what I mean by this is you're giving more tools to your hard carry on your team, or whatever that character or player is. Let's say you have a Reyna, for example. Reyna can buy a Ghost and 1 Leer, but if she had 2 Leers and she could buy her Devours, she would be way more effective, and the potential is she could completely hard carry, especially after she gets that first kill. She could snowball it really easily. Because of this, sometimes it's actually better to actually buy a Ghost for the entry fragger and stack that person or that carry with as much power as they could possibly get. Imagine a Reyna that buys light armor, 2 Leers, and someone buys her a Ghost. That Reyna is going to have the potential to single-handedly snowball the enemy team. So this is a really legitimately viable strategy, and it's something that's not incorporated enough because a lot of people are very one-track minded, they're very self-centered minded. But if you realize that if you give this Reyna this extra power boost, it will give you a bigger chance of winning than just having 1 or 2 extra abilities on your character, and it's going to greatly increase your chances of winning the first round. That is something that is definitely worth it. In the same vein, swapping weapons with an entry or dueler on your team, when you have a Vandal or AR and they just can only afford a Spectre, could be really powerful. A Sage doesn't want to be taking as aggressive duels as someone like a Phoenix, so giving the Phoenix the Phantom and taking the Spectre as the Sage makes a lot more sense when Sage is more defensive, wants to be playing towards the back of the pack, not peeking aggressively like a Pop Flasher would. Now, moving on to the last small advanced strat, we all know that you should really be destroying double doors on Haven. Really, you should be doing this almost every single time right off the bat because on attack it forces enemies out of that room, which is better for you so you don't get flanked from that angle, especially if you're trying to control mid. But another map specific strat that you might not know about is actually on the map Bind, setting up a slow orb or a recon through the teleporter and having an ally go and hide in the teleporter and control the teleporter, but the enemies didn't hear a person go into teleporter, only an ability, so you could potentially flank the enemy from the teleporter if they try to push hookah, which is just an interesting bonus strat that I thought I would throw in here. Anyway, smash that sub button if you enjoyed the video or if you learned even a single thing, and definitely let us know in the comments down below if there's any other advanced strats that you have been incorporating in your games but you haven't seen anyone talk about. Let us know down below. Anyways, that's all we got for you today. I'm Coach Mills, and until next time,